Hello, I'm Dave Feinlieb, and this is Beyond the Shelf. This show is an open exploration of the people and process behind e-commerce. Through conversations with innovators in the space, we learn the stories of these leaders and their strategies for e-commerce success. You can find out more about how we're helping leading brands and retailers optimize content at scale and learn about our new sell sheet builder at itsrapid.ai. My guest on today's show is Andrew Lipsman, an independent analyst and founder of Media, Ads, and Commerce. Prior to Media, Ads, and Commerce, Andrew was a vice president and principal analyst at Insider Intelligence, vice president of marketing at Cooler Screens, principal analyst at eMarketer, and senior vice president, marketing and insights at comScore. We discuss Andrew's new venture, Media, Ads, and Commerce, his insights on e-commerce and retail media, and his predictions for the next 12 months and beyond. Please enjoy my conversation with Andrew Lipsman. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Dave, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Take us back. How'd you get started in the space?
I've always been interested in data and insights, and I kicked off my career in market research at the NPD Group, working on the food business. Kraft was my first big client. So that was a good chance of getting my feet wet in data around consumer behavior and dipping my toe into the CPG space. I spent the bulk of my career, the longest stretch, about 12 years then at comScore. And in the early days, it was really the dawn of e-commerce measurement. We were the first company to be doing e-commerce measurement and talking a lot about, the early days of Cyber Monday. And then we were also doing web traffic measurement, but digital evolved very quickly. We followed the growth of digital video and digital ads research, the rise of social into mobile. Then we got into TV and cross-platform measurement. So I really got a chance to see the evolution of all things digital media, ads, and commerce. You'll see a theme here. And that's kind of how I got into the space. Then from there, it was pretty natural to move on to eMarketer, which is now Insider Intelligence, and has spent most of the past 5 or 6 years at that company covering the retail and e-commerce space. But retail media started to bubble up and became a big thing and became a big part of my coverage area. And also was the reason behind a stint that I had at Cooler Screens that you mentioned, seeing the potential around in-store media. So that's kind of the career arc in a minute or so.
How did you get your first job?
My first job, going way, way back, was a camp counselor. But in early career at NPD, it was actually by virtue of my dad's college roommate, right? We all have to take advantage of connections. So one of his college roommates was a senior exec at NPD back then.
This interest that you have in data, was that a natural thing? You were really into data and analytics? Is it something you learned, or how did that come about?
Oh, this is actually a fun question to answer, going way back machine. So I grew up in Chicago during the Michael Jordan era, and I would watch every Bulls game when I was a kid. And I, for some reason, was obsessed with Michael Jordan having a good field goal percentage. And as he would shoot throughout the game, I would consistently calculate the fractions. If he was 10 for 21 from the field, I would say, oh, he's shooting 47% from the field. So I was always doing these calculations. And I just had this affinity for data and statistics. And then as I got into high school and college, I really started to go deep on statistics. There's something about stats that really resonated with me early on. And so I think that was probably predicted where I would go in my career.
It's amazing. Great story. I love that you were calculating the odds while watching the games. Now, you've worked at some amazing and really well-known analytics and insights companies. What are some of your takeaways from the different experiences you've had at these different analytics and insights companies?
If I think about a single unifying theme, it is that it sits at the intersection of data and consumer behavior. And one thing that I have always known, but learned early on is, data, you don't look at data in a vacuum. It's representative of how humans are behaving. And so to really understand what's happening in the world of marketing, it's about consumer behavior. So even though we are awash in data. So much gets decided on based on what the data tells you. I never, ever lose sight of the humans behind the data. And so I think I would say as much about psychology and human behavior as I do about just looking at the data in isolation. So I think those things are inextricably linked, and you have to understand both if you want to know where things are going.
Love it. You've got a new venture, media, ads, and commerce. First of all, congratulations on spinning out on your own and starting something new.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's exciting. A lot is happening very fast because there is so much happening in the retail media space, but it's all been very fun and exciting.
Tell us about it. How's the experience? You're entrepreneurial, you're doing your own venture, and I think you're onto a space, obviously, that's very exciting, very timely. Love to hear about it.
Yeah, well, so first things first, I don't think of myself as an entrepreneur. In some sense, I wouldn't consider myself a risk taker. I do have a lot of conviction about the space and what I'm doing. And I've felt a strong need and urge to do that really just in the way that I saw fit. So that was the genesis of it. I also see so much beyond retail media. I think retail media is going to be at the center of everything in media, advertising, and commerce. But there's a lot that's happening beyond that in the space. And I wanted to be able to venture into some of that territory as well. So the name Media, Ads, and Commerce narrowly refers to a foundational concept that I've used in my retail media coverage, which is that Amazon initially, but a lot of other retailers have developed the retail media flywheel, developed around the pillars of media, ads, and commerce. So in that sense, it refers kind of specifically to what's happening in retail media, but more broadly, there are all these things happening at the convergence of media, advertising, and commerce around the space. So I will, I think in a lot of my coverage, kind of widen the aperture and talk about some of those issues that may not be explicitly retail media. They'll probably mostly be retail media adjacent. Most of what I cover will still touch on retail media, but sometimes it will go beyond that.
Retail media, speaking of which, tons of investment, tons of excitement. We just saw Walmart announce that they're buying Vizio. Talk us through that. What's going on there?
Well, it fits perfectly into this idea of the retail media flywheel. So to take it a few steps back, Amazon famously had this flywheel built around in e-commerce, price, selection, and convenience, right? And how those three things kind of fueled each other. Amazon used that initial flywheel to cement its leadership and maybe you would call it dominance in e-commerce. But Amazon started spinning up all these other businesses. When I started to cover it more closely in Amazon advertising, I realized they had this advertising business that at the time was being very underappreciated. They also had these media assets, and those media assets included things like Alexa, but also Prime Video, Twitch, things of that nature as well. And so all these things had the potential to work in harmony. And we've seen Amazon start to build out each of its three pillars. So it's not just e-commerce anymore. They've moved into physical commerce with Amazon Fresh and Whole Foods. Advertising, they put that on steroids, right? It's not just sponsored product ads, but it's ads that are moving up the funnel, offsite, and even into the store. And then and Amazon's NFL football games, right? So bigger versions of advertising. And then on the media side of things, they built out more content, more ad-supported content, and all within an integration point with Fire TVs. They introduced their own smart TVs that now Amazon can use to subsidize adoption of its TV operating system, where if it wants, it could maybe preference Prime Video content and enable more of that advertising experience. So it fuels the flywheel. Walmart has been doing an exceptional job of building out its own flywheel, modeling what Amazon is doing. It just doesn't have as many owned and operated assets going into this as Amazon. So it's advancing the strategy now. And, one of the first big things is going out and doing what is, to me, parallel to Amazon introducing the Fire TV smart TVs with Vizio.
But through a purchase.
They have to acquire it, right? It's going to take a longer time. And now is the right time, by the way. eMarketer data actually suggests that retail media streaming TV, that market, will go from about 0.8 billion in 2023 to 3.6 billion in 2024. So there's an inflection point happening right now. A lot of that's driven by Amazon and ad-supported Prime Video. But Walmart can and should have a piece of that. So I think that's what they're doing is they're accelerating their timeline to be able to partake in that opportunity.
Now, Walmart, like other retailers, also sells products, TVs, other devices from other vendors. How do those two things work together? How do brands think about this purchase by Walmart? You're an electronics vendor. How does this mesh with your relationship with Walmart, Amazon, your other retail partners?
Maybe some hurt feelings in the beginning. It's also increasingly just a reality of how business operates today. So I don't think it's a major surprise. And Walmart's big enough. What are they going to do? Stop selling at Walmart? So I don't think they're going to walk away. It can add some complexity to the equation, but I don't see this as, much more than a blip on what's going to happen at Walmart and consumer electronics.
This flywheel, I want to peel that back a little bit. You've got Amazon that kind of initiated this. You've got Walmart, as you mentioned, doing an amazing job at it. You've also got a whole series of other retailers with their retail media networks. Are they deploying this flywheel approach as well, or could they be deploying it? How are they thinking about that?
They're in various stages of development with their own flywheels. I would say Amazon and Walmart are way out ahead of most. But I could point to others like Instacart that I would say has a lot of the pieces in place already. If you're a retailer, you've got the commerce thing kind of figured out if you're a major retailer, right? The ads, they're all in various stages of introducing ads. Most of them have the basics tackled already in terms of sponsored product ads and a sponsored brand type of ad unit. But maybe not, they don't have a streaming, TV partnership or different partnerships in place yet. But the media piece, that is the missing piece of the equation for most of them. So they are partnering in much greater number with digital publishers, with the platforms in most cases, with programmatic partners like the Trade Desk, and with streaming TV partners. But I think that's the key piece that all of them are probably starting to focus their attention more on is how do I establish a bigger media presence so that I have access to inventory? Because at some point, supply gets constrained on your owned and operated website. There's only so many impressions you can deliver. They haven't maxed out yet. I don't think a lot of them are even close to it, quite frankly. But at some point, you need to be thinking about how you move into these other formats.
How do the brands that you talk to navigate that? They could be owned and operated. They do that directly through the retailer or the partner. Offsite and other properties that are part of the network, they could potentially get those from a host of different partners. How are they thinking about who to partner with, and what are some of the advantages of the different platforms?
Yeah, well, first off, how do they buy it? Usually those buys are going to happen through a DSP. So Amazon has its own DSP, which is in the mix for most major brands. But then, Trade Desk is kind of the other key player. So that's why Trade Desk has very smartly partnered with so many of the retailers to get access to their data to activate those buys. From there, it becomes what data is the best data or most valuable or is packaged in a way that I can make the best use of it. Maybe that's putting together interesting ways to segment audiences so that you can activate that easily. But other times it's just for your specific category. If you are a category leader in retail and a specialty retailer, you probably are going to have the best data or among the best data in the space. Where it gets more competitive probably is for the big grocery players, because a lot of them have a lot of density of data, a lot of transactions, and probably are mostly speaking to the same types of behaviors and audience segments. So obviously there's a huge number of brands that are going to be making use of that data, but that's probably where it gets most competitive.
It's a great insight. You've had some really incredibly insightful posts, both recently and over the past quite a while, where you've been doing posting. I'd love to explore some of the more recent ones with you. First, ROAS and click-through rate. You had this interesting question around the right metrics for measurement when it comes to retail media. Tell us a little about that.
The gist of it is that iROAS and ROAS are not correlated. And everybody is using ROAS as the metric to decision on. And yet it might not be driving what you're after, incremental sales at all, in many cases. So that first off has big implications that you can't look at ROAS blindly. But it also reminded me of the past in digital advertising when I was doing early digital ads research. with display ads, everyone measured campaign success through click-through rates for a display ad. Now, this is an ad where it's an impression for a brand, and it's trying to drive your awareness and how you feel about that brand, and maybe you purchase that brand days or weeks later. And yet we measured performance by clicks, and it was like, well, click-through rates were 0.1% of the time. So 1 out of every 1,000 people who sees that ad will actually click on the ad. Most of those ended up being accidental clicks. They were people who were kind of unsophisticated internet users. So those clicks themselves didn't even represent anything. They didn't correlate to sales or conversions. So it was a meaningless metric, and yet everyone did it anyway. And so to me, I just think the history of digital advertising is littered with examples of using the metrics that are the most available, the easiest to measure, whether or not they actually correlate to what you're trying to do at the end of the day. And so I just think ROAS is in parallel to that right now. And it's being looked at a little too blindly in most instances, and we need to get smarter, and we need to start looking at incrementality. I don't say throw out ROAS, but what I do say is look at these things together. Look at ROAS and iROAS and start to develop a familiarity with the fact that maybe you're getting a $4 ROAS for a CPG campaign, and that translates to an iROAS of $1.50. And that's okay, right? That $1.50 might look worse at face value, and you can't send it up the chain to executives, but that 50% return, if it's real, actually represents a great return on investment.
Will you take a moment and talk through how the measurement works, the different metrics, iROAS, ROAS, some of these different terms, and how you do the math on them?
ROAS is really just any sale or conversion that can be attributed post-exposure to an ad within an attribution window. So if I see an ad and I purchase something for that brand within the 14-day attribution window, you spent a certain amount of money on the ad, it drives a certain amount of sales, and that's how you compute ROAS. But this can be correlative, not necessarily causal. Seeing that ad may not have made you purchase it. You might have purchased that brand anyway. Establishing causality is really about understanding the difference between what would have otherwise happened if you never saw that ad. So you have to do a test and control. Look at the sales of a control group, let's say, who isn't exposed to the ad versus those who are. All of a sudden, the equation looks very different. The returns don't look as strong, but it's a much more real way of analyzing true impact of the advertising.
This control, how do you do that? How do people put that together in the real world? You've done this at comScore. You've done this at your other analytics roles and companies. How does that work in practice?
The simplest way is you're trying to control for all the variables that matter, but there's always these, it's a moving target. There's so many variables to try to control for. But in its simplest form, in the early days, we would say, let's look at 2 groups of people online, and we're going to control for standard demographics, what their overall internet usage behavior was, and any other things that kind of directly correlate to sales behavior. You control for those, and then you look at the group that is not exposed versus exposed. Now you have so many more complex variables. You can theoretically throw a lot more into the machinery to control for, but it also gets more complex, and it's harder to get a true apples to apples comparison in those groups. So then you have these different tests. Maybe you hold out you'll hear about geo-testing, holding out a specific geography as a way to test the sales response. There's all sorts of different ways to do it. I'm not, some people will advocate strongly for one method over the other. I think if you're doing it at all, that's a really good first step. No measurement is perfect. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Don't take the results as gospel of what the return is. But use it as directional indicators, and know that at least if you're translating from ROAS to incrementality, you are getting much closer to the true picture of reality.
That's great. Now, if we kind of zoom out, the brands have a whole host of different channels now that they could be advertising on: retail media, social media, in-store, out of home. We hear a number of different opportunities that a brand might want to invest in. So I'd love if you could talk about the different channels and how you're seeing brands make some trade-offs and think about how to balance the investments across the different opportunities?
Yeah, well, the simplest way to think about retail media and its evolution is on-site, off-site, and in-store. So on-site, primarily search, sponsored products, but it started to move into the upper funnel formats of sponsored brand video, things of that nature. Then off-site is off-site programmatic. It's, the big social platforms, and it's streaming TV, which is now starting to become a bigger piece of the equation. And then you have in-store, which right now is very small. It's just a few $100 million market. But it's one that I'm very optimistic on because I see the potential. It has tremendous scale. It's just a lot of things have to happen first for it to really grow and evolve as a media channel. One, you need to get the screens into stores. Two, you got to enable the infrastructure for the buying of it. You need measurement. Investment moves with measurement. I mean, I think that's also the big story of digital advertising is when you can look at and see the return on advertising, the closed loop measurement, that's when dollars start to move in a more significant way. You need that for in-store ads. But, and this is my argument, you also need to start looking at the fact that it's driving and can drive considerable scale. So it's actually a medium that I think is more akin to TV than it is to sponsored products, for example. What do I mean by that? There's massive audiences at the biggest retailers. Walmart reaches 200 million people a month, Target over 100 million, and most of the other big retailers over 50 million a month. Like this is a scale of major broadcast TV networks. And by the way, linear TV, it's harder and harder to reach the audiences that you want because people are watching it less. So if you are a national brand and you're trying to figure out where do I put my spend that right now is getting very expensive in linear TV, this is one place you can start to slice off a little bit of that budget and start moving it into in-store ads. It just hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of organizational reasons, I think, behind that. It will happen. It's just going to take some time.
There's one other area in the advertising retail media space, this sort of tension between the shopper experience and the ad surface area. How are retailers navigating that? Obviously, they'd love to have as much surface area, I imagine, as they could, but ultimately they also want to make sure the shopper's having a great experience and getting to buy the products that they want to buy. How do you think about balancing those two aspects when it comes to advertising?
There is potentially a huge tension. I think that retailers very smartly are, in this case, thinking like retailers first. They do not want to disrupt the customer experience. So I think they'd probably been maybe a little too reticent to move into this because it potentially is interruptive. But here's the thing. There's a smart way to move into in-store media. To me, there are certain surfaces that are a little bit more fraught in terms of the potential to disrupt customer experience. There are also ones that, frankly, I see as no-brainers. You can either test them easily. You don't have to make a major investment. I always say that the two big inhibitors between retailers moving into in-store retail media are CX and CapEx. They don't want to have to spend a lot of money to put screens in their stores, but they also don't want anything that's going to get in the way of people's shopping behavior. Pick the right surfaces first. I've got research that really shows some of the ones that are very, very low risk. Start there, test and learn, understand it, and then evolve and get into maybe the more complex environments in the store.
Great. So many great insights you've got there. I've got to unpack them, I think, on a future episode. I've got a ton of ideas on more questions I'd love to ask you. I want to ask you about AI, though. Seems like no conversation these days is complete without talking about AI. Where are you seeing that play into retail media, into media more broadly? And how much of it is in production, really being rolled out in practice versus more of a test and learn stage?
I tend to delineate in thinking about AI more as like the generative AI, which is creating new things based on pre-existing variables. That has a lot of different implications. So I'll pause on that. The machine learning component to me is that there's like this brute force optimization that can be done now that you couldn't previously done when you're optimizing within constraints. And I think that within constrained environments like understanding the detail that you put within product detail pages, that's a place where optimization can do a good job. I will say this, let the AI or the ML run through the optimizations, but you always want to have a human touch at the end of that just to double check and make sure that it makes sense and not just blindly optimizing. That's the first thing. Creative is another one. You can run through a lot of different creative optimizations. You can also get some really Frankenstein creative coming out of it, right? So you can't just set it and forget it. Again, it can give you good ideas. It can give you creative that should test well and actually work better in driving conversions. Just make sure you've got that human who's putting some eyes on it at the end of that funnel. So that's where I'm seeing it kind of enter into the equation. But then, the generative AI stuff, I think it's frankly, most of that is going to take a lot more time to play out because it's interesting. It looks cool. We're seeing a step change, but it spins out a lot more error and information that you just can't rely on yet. It hasn't hit the reliability threshold for me to put confidence in it yet.
Thinking ahead to the next 12 months, what would be your top 3 predictions looking ahead for this year, heading into next year?
Here's the first one that I'll start with. Actually, the first 2 are going to be on this notion of the retail media flywheel. And the first prediction is that I think Walmart is going to acquire a streaming TV content provider next. So, right, they've got the point of integration for their content now with the TVs, but I think they need to expand their foothold beyond partnerships. I think they need some more owned and operated assets. So I think there's potential players out there that Walmart should think now about acquiring and owning more of their own stack when it comes to full funnel retail media. The second one is that I think we're going to also see the next tier of retail media networks begin to acquire digital media companies, but in this case, digital content publishers. Many digital publishers today are distressed assets, or their valuations are lower than they have been, but they still have a lot of inventory. They have scale, and there's adjacencies between specialty retailers, for example, and contextually relevant content. So we haven't seen it yet, but I just think you're going to see, think about a grocery retailer, for example, acquiring like a recipes.com. That's the type of, all of a sudden it opens up the ability to put your brand and other brands in front of people at the right moments and expand that inventory in a smarter way. The third, this is on generative AI. So I saw a prediction today by Gartner. This is actually an anti-prediction. So there's a prediction by Gartner that was saying that by 2026, there was going to be a 25% decline in search. Have you seen this prediction yet? So
have not seen that yet.
So, I mean, that's headline grabbing. And I went and unpacked it and said, whoa, 25%. That doesn't pass my smell test. And sure enough, that's what it was saying. And I will just say that doesn't pencil out in any shape, form, or fashion that I could think of at all. I don't know sometimes how predictions like this get made. We're about a year and a half into the Gen AI era. And have we seen that much change in search? Has search fallen off a cliff? No, it's probably the same as it has been. People have been experimenting, but there's at most an early adopter segment that might be shifting some of their natural search activity to Gen AI searches. Fast forward 2 years, how do you get to 25%? Even those early adopters are the people who are most keyed into this. Are they going to shift 25% of their behavior? What about all the people who are not early adopters? Well, how much of their activity is going to shift? It just doesn't make any sense. So I think like a 1% shift, if that happened, would be dramatic. And frankly, I think it's more likely that search continues to grow over the next 2 years.
Yeah, it's great to, as you said, have conviction, and we'll check in with you on your predictions. But I'd love to ask you a few quick questions if you're up for it before we wrap up. This is a tough one. I know it's hard to choose just 2, but what 2 people have inspired you the most in your professional life?
It's actually an easier question to answer than I would have thought. There are a lot of people and many great people in this space, but I have to give a lot of credit to my career mentor. I consider Jan Falgoni. So he was the longtime IRI CEO back in the 80s and 90s, and then he was one of the co-founders of comScore. When I entered comScore in 2005, I was lucky. This is where you get those lucky career breaks. I was lucky to be put in a spot where I could work alongside him, and worked alongside him for a dozen years and just learned a tremendous amount as somebody who's both super sharp when it comes to research, measurement, but also a great communicator, articulator of ideas, and also just a great person. So I just feel very lucky to have learned from him for so long. He was, I think, the premier digital thought leader for a long time in this space. There was one year where I was helping him out with a lot of presentations. I think he did 50 presentations over the course of a year, so one a week. This was probably like 2012 or so. So he was really doing the circuit. And then after I left comScore, I went to eMarketer, which was founded by Jeff Ramsey. I didn't work in the same office as Jeff Ramsey. I didn't work with him as closely or as often as I did with Jan, but I will say he left a major impression on me. I knew him before I started working there, but I will say the quality of the interactions that I had with him were always tremendous. He's a very generous person, and also an incredible thought leader who does the presentation circuit. So I feel fortunate that when I look back on my career, not only did I get to work alongside two great people, but also like maybe the two best thought leaders in the digital space. That was lucky for what I'm doing today to be able to learn from the two best.
So I suppose in a way, with your research and writing, we're getting the benefit not only of your insights, but maybe theirs as well, channeled through you.
You don't know how many times when I'm working on a slide and I will channel Jan's voice in my head as I'm writing it out. In fact, the post that you alluded to on the display ads and click-through rates, so much of that came from work that Jan really pioneered. And yes, I was channeling the way that he talked about the topic as I was writing.
Outside of work and family, what's your favorite hobby when you do get some downtime?
So I'm a basketball guy. I've always loved sports. I have two kids now, so I don't have as much time to watch it as I used to. But I'm watching my kids now. They're 10 and 7, and they play a lot of basketball, a lot of Little League baseball too. So I coach them in most of these leagues. My oldest son has now gotten into travel basketball. So we've had many weekends recently that involve 5 or 6 basketball games in a weekend. So I would say that is my new hobby. I don't think I've ever had as much fun as a parent. So yes, that is my new hobby.
I love it. It's so important to have fun as a parent. So I commend you on that. That's great to hear. If people want to get in touch with you and learn more about your new venture, what's the best way for them to find you online?
LinkedIn is the easiest way. I'm on it all the time. It's my primary channel, so feel free to reach out to me there directly. And if you want to subscribe to my newsletter where I'm doing my writing, it's Media, Ads, and Commerce, all spelled out, .substack.com.
Well, Andrew, it's been insightful. I've learned a ton. I want to have you back to talk about more of these topics and more of your posts. But in the meantime, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Dave, thank you for having me. Please hold me accountable to my predictions, and I'd love to be back.
I hope you enjoyed today's show. Beyond the Shelf is brought to you by It's Rapid. It's Rapid is the platform Pepsi, Sierra Nevada, Revlon, and hundreds of other leading brands and retailers use to build personalized content at scale. Whether that's images, videos, or product descriptions for their product detail pages, shoppable videos or banners for their digital ad campaigns, or sell sheets for sales enablement, brands that use It's Rapid are able to produce high-quality, on-brand content on average more than 80% faster than category competitors. To find out more, please visit itsrapid.ai. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Beyond the Shelf.